Hi, I'm Christoph, and today I'm going to show you how to make these Ghibli-inspired procedural clouds in Blender. I made these clouds because I had spent time making cloud brushes in Photoshop to speed up my cloud painting process, and I wondered if I could supplement this with some procedural clouds. After trying a lot of different ideas, I came up with a solution that matched the Ghibli style closely, and I turned it into a shader. If you would just like to try out these clouds, there's a free link to the shader in the description. But today I also want to show you how to make these clouds yourself and the different techniques I've put into them. I will also release a video on how the settings of the shader work, and you can also see this linked in the description. I also want to give a shout out to Lightning Boy Studio. This week they're releasing a Ghibli style volumetric cloud tutorial, and I can't wait to see what they came up with. I will link to them in my description. So without further ado, let's start building some clouds. Let's start a new scene. Delete the camera, delete the cube, delete the light. Let's add a plane. And we are going to dive directly into the shader editor. Let's add a new material. Delete the principal BSDF. And we are going to add a emission shader. Next up, we're going to add a gradient texture. Set it to quadratic sphere. And we are going to add a mapping node and a texture coordinate node. Let's plug the object into the vector node of the mapping. And this is going to center our sphere. Next up, we're going to add a vector curve. And we're going to plug it in between the texture coordinate and the mapping node. By manipulating the values, we are able to shape the sphere. And I'm going to set the curve into this slanted smiley curve until we get this shape. And this will be the base for our cloud. Next up, we're going to add a voronoi texture. And this will give us more detail and also little puffs of cloud. Let's add a mix RGB. Set it to soft light. And we are going to plug our voronoi texture into the soft light by using the distance. Set it to the maximum setting. And we are going to add a color ramp. Let's invert the colors. And for now, we are going to leave the scale at 5. To see what we are doing, we can add a color ramp in between the soft light and our emission shader. And we can set it to constant. And this will give us a hard edge. As you can see, this allows us to create these simple cloud shapes. And we will keep adding layers of voronoi just to add levels of detail. So let's select our voronoi texture and our soft light and color ramp, and let's copy paste them in. Add it to our node structure. And this time, we're going to set the scale to 20. The soft light slider is going to be a control for our detail. So if we slide it back, we have less detail. And if we slide it up, we get some more. Let's add one more layer of voronoi. Select the voronoi color ramp soft light, copy paste it in, and add it to our node structure. And this time we're going to set scale to 50. Again, this gives us another layer of details, and we are able to control this by using the soft light slider. If we remove the color ramp and plug this directly into our emission shader, we can see that we have this soft voronoi detail that we can use later to give our shader a bit more detail and also to give a bit more depth. For now, let's plug the color ramp back in. And let's go to our mapping node of the gradient texture. And we are going to plug it into the vector of our voronoi textures. This means the vector curve will also affect the geometry of the details we are going to add. Up next, we are going to add some distortion. And we are going to do this by adding a noise to the scale of our mapping node. So let's add a texture noise and a color mix RGB. Plug the mix RGB into the scale. And let's plug our noise texture FAC into color 1. We're going to set the color to a white color. Let's set the scale to 15 and detail to 10. This will allow us to distort the edges and the geometry of our entire cloud. And this mix node is a slider that controls the amount of distortion. If we want very small distortion, we can add a high scale, like 50. And then if we move the slider only a tiny bit, we get this nice and jagged effect on the edges. So by playing the scale, you can get some varying effects. For now, we're going to set it to 50. And we are going to set the mix to 0.9. Let's set our second soft light to 0.2. And the soft light of our tiny detail to 0.1. Next up, we are going to turn this into a transparent shader. Plug the emission shader into a mix shader and add a transparent shader. Let's plug our color ramp into the alpha of the mix shader. And let's invert this. To make this work, go to the material properties, set blend mode to alpha blend, and shadow mode to none. Now we have created an alpha for our cloud, and by setting the constant to a linear and manipulating the black and white values, we can get either a soft edge or a quasi-hard edge. What we can also do is add a third node, set it to an almost zero color, or I mean almost black color, and place it close to the white node, and this will give us some glow. For now, we're going to delete this node. We might use it later, and set it to some soft edges. Next up, we're going to start working on the shading and colors. Let's plug our soft light into a new color ramp. And let's plug our color ramp into the emission shader. Now set the black to a blue. And we're going to set the white to a soft grayish yellow. This color ramp will give us some control. By moving the sliders, we can get either more of the highlight or more of the shadows. Also, by manipulating it, we can get more details, and there's also some nice geometry apparent that we can use in there. For now, we're gonna set it to a soft setting. Next up, we're going to add a shadow. Let's add a color, mix RGB, and set it to multiply. Let's add a gradient texture. Plug it into the multiply. Or better yet, let's plug it into the alpha of the multiply. And for now, we're going to set our color to red. Let's set our gradient texture to spherical. Let's add a mapping node and a texture coordinate node. And let's plug the object into the vector. Let's add a color ramp after the gradient texture. And let's manipulate the controls to position our shadow. Let's lower it by lowering the X value. Let's scale the X value as well. And we are going to leave it at these settings for now. Now we want to distort our shadow. We're going to do this by adding another mapping node. And we are going to plug a noise into the scale, just like we did to distort our gradient texture for the alpha. So let's add a color RGB mix node, plug it in, and let's add a noise texture. Plug the FAC into the color, and we're going to set our second color to white. Going to set the scale to 11 and detail to 9. Our mix node also acts as a slider. And we're going to set it to 0.3. We can add a color RGB node, mix RGB node, after the color ramp. Set it to black. And this allows us to manipulate the transparency of our shadow. Next up, I want to add a gradient to the geometry of our colors. So let's set our shadow to 1 for now to make it disappear. Let's add a gradient texture. Let's add a mapping and texture coordinate node. Let's add a color mix RGB in between the soft light and our color ramp. And we are going to set it to multiply. Plug our gradient texture into it. And now by manipulating this slider, we can add a bit of gradient to our shading. And the next thing we want to do is add a color ramp. And that way we have control over our gradient. I'm going to set it to these settings for now. The last thing I want to do is add an edge highlight. We will be able to do this by adding a color ramp and add a mix RGB node after our color ramp and after our shadow. Let's plug our soft light into the color ramp and plug this into our mix RGB. And we're going to set it from mix to color dodge. Let's set the color dodge to 1 and let's invert our color ramp. And as you can see, this will give us a highlight. Let's add our shadow by manipulating this mix RGB. And let's set the shadow color to a dark blue. And now our color dodge slider allows us to add more or less of the highlight. You could also use a screen or you could plug the color ramp into the alpha. And then you could use a custom color. But for now, I'm just going to plug the color ramp into the color. We now have everything we want to make a nice cloud. And so we're going to add some reference to pick some nice colors. So let's go to our reference folder and drag our reference into Blender. Let's select a blue color for our background as a reference. Let's go to our color ramp. We can select a yellow that's closer to the one in our reference. Select a blue. One thing I'm also going to do is I'm going to change my color management to standard. And this changes all of the colors and allows me to get it more accurate. Now we are going to pick a color for the shadow. Let's set our edge highlight to color dodge. And now, last but not least, let's go to the color ramp that's plugged into our alpha. And let's add some settings to get a nicer edge, closer to what we have in our reference. One of the last things I'm going to do is change the first voronoi we made into a smaller scale. Let's set it to 3. One last thing I want to do is I want to completely randomize the cloud. And to do that, we are going to add a mapping node and add it behind the mapping node of our distortion and plug this into our voronoi texture. Now let's add a input object info, and we can either plug in the location or the random into our location. If we plug in random into location, this is going to generate a random cloud each time we create a new one. So if we press Alt D, we can generate a new cloud each time. If we plug in the object location, it is going to generate a new cloud every time we move our cloud. And after playing around with the various settings to get it a bit closer to our reference, I came up with this result. One of the things I changed was for the shadows. I added the color ramp into the alpha of the mix shader, and that allows me to pick a custom color. And that concludes our tutorial. I hope these techniques were useful. I will add a link to the source files in the description. Let me know if you liked it. Please like and subscribe, and talk to you next time.